All right, good afternoon, everybody. I'm Joanna Cohen. I'm director of the Institute for Global Tobacco Control here at the School of Public Health. Welcome to our monthly Innovations in Tobacco Control seminar series. And today I'm really pleased to introduce our guest speaker, Dr. Tesfa Alexander, who has a wealth of passion and experience in public health communications. So he, I guess you sort of knew what you had a sense of your interest for quite a while. So he has a Bachelor of Arts in English Writing and Speech Communication, and then went on to do an MA in Organizational Communication, and has a PhD in Cross-Cultural Health Communication. So we've got a real expert here. On top of all that learning, he's also had very personal on-the-job experience. I think over 13 years of experience with communication science projects, both for federal clients and nonprofit organizations. So currently he's at Battelle, and let me just get the right. So he's the Director of Health Communications Research and Social Marketing at Battelle. And previous to that, for the previous number of years, had been at the Center for Tobacco Products at the U.S. Food and Drug Administration, and had been leading their health communications work, leading both the formative research for some of the big campaigns that the FDA has done around tobacco, as well as leading the outcome evaluation work. So some of the big campaigns that you may have heard of at the FDA have been The Real Cost, Fresh Empire, and This Free Life. So they've done really well. He's also been, he also is currently the formative research senior advisor to the CDC National Tobacco Education Campaign, and he is an adjunct professor in health communication at the University of Memphis. So wealth of experience, and today Dr. Alexander is going to speak to us about tobacco control, I guess, public health education campaigns, and I guess what's been happening, what the trends are, and sharing his insights from that work. So welcome, and thank you for being here.
Thank you. Thank you for that introduction, Joanna. Thank you all for having me here. I'm really excited to be here to share my insights and my experiences developing public education campaigns at the FDA and my work in the development and implementation of public education campaigns. Today I'll be sharing some insights from my experiences, taking a science-based and a practical approach to developing and implementing public education campaigns. One thing of note is that everything shared today is based on publicly available and published information, doesn't reflect the views of my former employer, the U.S. Food and Drug Administration, nor does it reflect the views of my current employer, Battelle Memorial Institute, or any of Battelle's clients. So if there are any praises or questions or non-praises, please direct them directly towards me. So starting off, I'd like to start off as an introduction to who I am with this image of Mr. T. If you've had an opportunity to hear me speak before, you're probably familiar with this image. And there are a couple of things. So Joanna gave a very nice introduction to who I am, and at the core of who I am, in addition to that, I would say on a personal level, beyond my professional accomplishments, I'm a big fan of Mr. T. So when I think about myself, and this started as a young age with my name being Tesfa, and for a number of reasons, I really held Mr. T to a high standard and still do today as a role model. How that relates to my work professionally, I feel fortunate to be a part of a team throughout my various experiences, both at FDA, prior to FDA, and where I am now, where I've had the opportunity to learn a great deal of information from a lot of really smart and dynamic people and leaders in the field of health communication, as well as in the field of messaging and advertising. And I'll share some of the learnings that I've gathered from working with those colleagues. Health communication, starting with the operational definition of health communication and what do we mean by health communication. Health communication is a very broad field. It ranges from mass media, mass communication, all the way to interpersonal communication in the context of clinical settings, from patient-provider interactions. And so when I speak about health communication today and public education campaigns, I consider health communication a science-based discipline. So thinking about health communication as a science, and there's a practical component, which we will touch on, but also the focus on the ability to change knowledge, attitudes, beliefs, and behaviors on a wide scale, and borrowing from practices in social marketing and tactics in social marketing, where we want to understand the breadth of our audience, understand the environments that they live in, and in turn influence their decisions and behaviors in a public health, positive public health lens. The value of public education campaigns and the value of tobacco messaging has been shown and demonstrated in a number of different ways. We have leaders and leading institutions, from the National Cancer Institute to the World Health Organization and others, who advocate for public education campaigns and tobacco public education campaigns as part of a comprehensive tobacco control policy and comprehensive tobacco control initiatives. We know that mass media campaigns can and have reduced use of tobacco among youth, young adults, as well as adults. They are effective as part of a comprehensive tobacco control approach and have proven to be effective independently, if not a part of a comprehensive tobacco control approach, have been proven to be effectively as a standalone approach. And they have a significant impact because they're able to reach a large number of the population, both efficiently and in many ways in a cost-effective way. Tobacco education campaigns, I say, and I'm biased obviously, are the model to the development and implementation of effective mass media messages within a public health setting. So I say that because I'm biased, but a more objective view comes from Melanie Wakefield, Robert Hornick, and others in a review published in The Lancet about 7-8 years ago, where they looked at the impact of public education campaigns in a number of public health topics, so ranging from tobacco to alcohol, nutrition, road safety, and you found that tobacco, along with road safety, had the strongest evidence of benefit when it comes to messaging and having a public health impact. Where it all began, let's talk about that and date back to where the development and the implementation of successful and measurable public education campaigns began. So back in 1967, the FCC introduced the Fairness Doctrine. And what the Fairness Doctrine included was an approach where we wanted to have a balance between pro-tobacco marketing, cigarette advertising, as well as anti-tobacco messaging and advertising to communicate the harms of tobacco use. So there was a requirement to have a ratio for every 3 pro-tobacco ads that were aired. You had to have at least 1 anti-tobacco messaging on air, or commercial on air. And those advertisements, the anti-tobacco messaging, borrowed, or I shouldn't say not borrowed, maybe created or led the methods, and many of the methods that we see today, with building and using messages that focus on the health consequences of smoking and using fear appeal. And this approach, through measurable results, showed that it had an impact on national aggregate smoking as well as smoking among adolescents. Some fun facts: what else was going on in 1967? Some people argue that 1967 was the greatest year for music. We had a number of different people doing some significant, some personal preferences of mine, making some hits such as Jimi Hendrix. It was also the year of the largest peace march in Washington, D.C. So fast forward to where we are today and the campaigns that many of us know today. And for you all who are not familiar with these public education campaigns, I'll give you some context for it. So fast forward to 2000, the year 2000, with the introduction of the National Truth Campaign. The Truth Campaign was very instrumental in my life as a youth/young adult at that time, and many of us remember the vivid images from the Truth Campaign. The Truth Campaign was launched by what was then known as the Legacy Foundation, what's now known as the Truth Initiative. And the Truth Campaign really broke a lot of ground when it came to messaging on a wide scale about the impact of tobacco use and a negative impact of tobacco use. Followed by the Truth Campaign 8 years later was the Become an X campaign. The Truth Campaign focused on prevention among youth, and the Become an X campaign launched by Legacy was a focus on cessation among adults and promoting smoking cessation among adults. A few years later, in 2012, we had the Tips from Former Smokers campaign launched by the CDC, and the TIPS campaign is the first federally funded and largest and first paid national public education campaign, and has had significant success to date from their launch to today. And the TIPS campaign is on air as we speak and is actually getting ready to launch their 7th year in a few weeks, which is an exciting time for the CDC. The FDA in 2014 launched The Real Cost campaign, general market campaign, targeted towards youth ages 12 to 17 to communicate the harms of smoking to youth across the nation who are susceptible to tobacco use or experimenting with tobacco. In 2014, we had the reemergence of Truth with their Finish It campaign. And then in 2015, the FDA launched its second campaign, Fresh Empire, targeted towards multicultural youth ages 12 to 17. And then lastly, of note, the FDA's This Free Life campaign launched in 2016 for LGBT young adults who are social or intermittent tobacco users. So right now, it's an exciting time, a really exciting time for health communication and public education campaigns within the field, and overall looking at the influx of public education campaigns. We have a lot that's in market right now that's doing a lot of great work, and it's needed. We've had significant and thankfully decreases in the number of adults, young adults, as well as youth who use tobacco, specifically smoking, and significant declines over the past decade plus due to work by Dr. Cohen and others. And that being said, we have reached the hardest to reach population. So there's still a significant number of youth, young adults, and adults who use tobacco products, and we all know that tobacco use is the leading cause of preventable death and disease. And so there's still a lot of work to be done, and there's still a lot of hard work to be done because this is the hardest to reach or hardest to move segment. What ties all of these campaigns together besides tobacco? I would say, one, they've had demonstrated effectiveness and published and demonstrated effectiveness and significant demonstrated effectiveness. And they also are evidence-based. And the evidence-based and science-based approach that all of these campaigns have taken to their development and implementation is what has driven their success. This comic strip embodies how I feel about the purpose of science and evidence-based. So I'll read it for you all. Reading it from right to left, left to right. Your analysis does not confirm to my preconceived notions, so my gut instinct is telling me that you are wrong. When your gut talks to you, what does it use for a mouth? So with that, just interjecting a little bit of humor here, the development of public education campaigns requires a scientific approach, and it requires a scientific approach when you want to have an end goal of having behavioral impact in the long run. And there, we often have to remind ourselves, and I point to myself as a health communication scientist as well as a health communication practitioner, that we always have to point back to the science, point back to the literature, point back to the evidence to help guide where we go and guide what we do. With the development of campaigns, we use a framework that comes in different forms. I chose today to use a framework developed by the World Health Organization that divides campaign development and campaign implementation to 3 phases. So there's a planning phase, the implementation phase, as well as an evaluation phase. Within the planning phase, we have 3 areas: tobacco control strategy. So that's an easy check. We all agree that public education campaigns have significant value and a place within your overall comprehensive tobacco control strategy. Then there's formative research, understanding what we want to do, help design our public education strategy and our messaging approach, and then testing those messages, which I'll spend a good amount of time explaining those different components. Then there's the implementation of your advertising campaign or your messaging campaign. Where do we want to place our ads, paid media, and where do we want to have a place for earned media, unpaid media coverage of a particular campaign or campaign message. Then there's the evaluation component, process and outcome evaluation, where we want, with process evaluation, getting an understanding of what we intended to do, is it working as intended, and outcome evaluation, obviously the impact. Distilling all of that and that framework into this sort of an illustration, and I'll use this illustration to walk through the rest of today's discussion. There are various components, 5 components. So I think about it as pre-market versus in-market. What's everything that we need to do before we actually put an advertisement on air and on TV or through social media? And that includes a significant amount of formative research, message development, concept development, ad testing, and then in-market implementation and evaluation. So starting with message development. Message development is the core and the foundation of an advertising campaign and developing a public education campaign. Obviously, and that may be pretty obvious for you all, considering that it's the first phase. Within the message development phase, this is the foundational phase of developing and creating a public education campaign. We rely on a slew of secondary data sources. There are elements of primary data collection. They're largely and mostly qualitative in nature and some quantitative components. But within this phase, we want to understand and define what's our strategy, what our objectives, and who our target audience is. There are so many elements to the message development phase, and I would say with each one of these components, or each one of these boxes, I can spend 40 minutes describing and explaining and sharing really interesting and exciting for me, at least, insights. But I'll touch on highlights from each one, areas that I think are maybe of interest to you. A key component within the message development phase, as I mentioned, is understanding who your audience is. Who are we trying to reach? So with whom there is a need is the first question. So where are there high rates of tobacco use, high rates of susceptibility? Who is my target audience? So beyond demographics, who are we talking about? Moving beyond specific traditional demographics of race, ethnicity, sex, etc., geography. What are their psychographics? What are their values? What are their interests? What are their influences? And I would argue those psychographics tend to be more important than demographics for a lot of different reasons, and it ties to beliefs and changing their beliefs, which we'll discuss. What are their tobacco norms, their risk perceptions? What are their media environments? How do they consume media? What type of media do they use? What motivates them? What are their key knowledge, attitudes, beliefs? And using and identifying those key knowledge, attitudes, and beliefs, and using those as levers for change. And then lastly, how do we segment them? A lot of scholars in the field argue or have demonstrated that segmentation based on demographics is an archaic way of doing things. And we should, if we are going to segment, if we segment it at all, we should be looking more at psychographics and what are within that segmentation strategy, understanding what are their shared traits and their norms. This slide provides some context for how that information is used. So we have the campaigns that I mentioned, the Real Cost, French Empire, Finish It, By the Truth campaign, This Free Life, and the Tips from Former Smokers. So what I'll do is I'll walk through the top row of the demographic information, some of the demographic information that each one of these campaigns entails. And then I'll use the Real Cost and Fresh Empire, just those two columns on the left, to share the differences between those two audiences. So with the Real Cost, we have youth, and the target of youth, general market youth, ages 12 to 17, youth across the country. Fresh Empire, specific youth, an overlap of youth, but multicultural youth and multicultural youth who affiliate with what's called the hip hop peer crowd. For the Truth campaign, they've aged up since the reemergence of Truth, where they're focused on youth and young adults, ages 15 to 21 years old. This Free Life, as I mentioned before, LGBT young adults, 18 to 24 years old. And the Tips from Former Smokers campaign, adults ages 18 to 54 years old. Looking at the Real Costs and who the Real Cost is reaching and who Fresh Empire is reaching. So moving beyond their age and those specific demographic, that specific demographic category, how do they define themselves? What are their key attributes? What are their tobacco norms? What are their risk perceptions? So we know from information shared by FDA, with the Real Cost, their target audience is 12 to 17 year olds, and they often define themselves by expressing their independence. They don't want to be seen as a kid, and they also want to be in the know. In comparison, Fresh Empire and the Fresh Empire youth target, they define themselves by being in control, and they want to be in control. They see themselves as trendsetters, and they see themselves in high value in terms of being fashionable. Some key attributes to the Fresh Empire target audience: they're often stressed. They have poor coping skills, and they are more frequently not academically driven. In comparison, the key attributes for the Fresh Empire target is that they have a high value on authenticity. They see themselves as being creative, and they really aspire to be leaders, both within their peer groups and beyond. Some of the tobacco norms. The Real Cost, they often are surrounded by smokers, and smoking is a norm within their groups, both when it comes to peers and families. And for Fresh Empire, those youth see smoking as being accepted when they are in high stress environments and in social settings. They share similar risk perceptions, where they believe that a limited pattern of use or intermittent use will not lead to long-term use or addiction. This information is distilled in what is defined and used frequently in advertising and marketing as personas. And these are two example personas from FDA that's available on their website for the Fresh Empire campaign. On the left, you have Nikki, who is the persona for FDA's general market general market campaign, the Real Cost. I think I said Fresh Empire, my correction. This is for FDA's the Real Cost campaign. You have Nikki, and you have Travis, who is a persona for FDA's the Real Cost rural smokeless tobacco education campaign. Nikki she struggles with her social life. She has a difficult time at home, a difficult time in school. She's often stressed, and life life is particularly hard for Nikki, as described from the data that's collected by FDA. And Nikki smokes, but smokes intermittently. She's an experimenter. Whereas on the other side, you have Travis. Travis lives in a rural community, is really close to his family. He has strong bonds with not only his family, but his friends. He's really into gaming, girls, music, trucks. He cares about school, and it's really important to him to be able to fit in. And he is surrounded by smokeless tobacco use. Smokeless tobacco use is a cultural norm for him. With these personas, what is used in the development of public education campaigns is thinking about Nikki and Travis as examples in every stage of the campaign development as well as implementation process. So with Nikki and Travis, if we could reach one person, and let's use Nikki as an example. If I'm going to launch a campaign, if I could reach one person, I want it to be Nikki. And therefore, what do I need to do to influence Nikki? So keeping Nikki in mind throughout the stages of both research and going down to the ground level of when we're recruiting people and we want to have a focus group room full of participants. I'm hoping that it's a room full of Nikkis, and that goes into not just from a qualitative anecdotal perspective, but also when it comes to designing our screeners, instruments, etc. Another component of the message development phase is looking at campaign themes and developing campaign messaging themes. There are a number of themes and approaches that one can take when developing a public education campaign, and that ranges from industry tactics to family influence. With industry tactics, that's highlighting the efforts by the industry to target certain groups and manipulate certain groups, lie to them as well, and this is an approach that most of us are familiar with, that the Truth Campaign has taken. Health consequences, looking at both short-term and long-term health consequences. Short-term consequences, highlighting the impact of tobacco use, and short-term consequences such as having bad breath, yellow teeth, wrinkled skin. It's an approach that FDA's The Real Cost campaign has taken, and successfully so. Long-term consequences, illustrating the effects of tobacco use, which we're all familiar with, such as disease and death, which is an approach that TIPS has taken, as well as many other public education campaigns, both domestically and internationally. Harmful chemicals, highlighting not just the type of chemicals that are in tobacco and tobacco smoke, but also the number of chemicals that are in tobacco and tobacco smoke. Addiction, highlighting the impact of tobacco addiction, obviously. Secondhand smoke, which has been proven to be not as effective when developing public education campaigns, but the impact of smoking on others, as we all are familiar with. Youth access, discouraging sales of tobacco to minors. FDA and others have taken this approach, and from a regulatory standpoint when educating to retailers. And social norms and peer crowds, dispelling deceptions that smoking is cool within your social norm or within your peer crowd, and that tobacco use is socially acceptable. And lastly, family influencing, highlighting the impact and the modeling behaviors that you may be doing for a sibling or for a child. There are so many campaign themes to choose from. What direction do we go in? So remember that comment strip that I showed you. So maybe I can go with my gut, past experience, or intuition. What we advocate for is an objective and an empirical approach to campaign theme selection, and one that has been developed and crafted by Robert Hornick and Wolf. So Hornick and Wolf came up with an approach that has been used both in the past and most recently with FDA and others for finding an objective and empirical approach to identifying message themes. And that's through using quantitative and largely cross-sectional survey data. And so the premise of the Hornick and Wolf approach is that there should be three criteria. One, a belief should be strongly associated with targeted intention. And that is based on the theoretical foundation, which is the following slide, that we know that intention is a precursor to behavior. Second, that a particular belief should not be already highly endorsed by a large number of the population. So if I am educating on the harm of tobacco use and in the context of causing cancer, we already know that. A lot of people already know that. How can we find a belief where there's room to change, where there isn't a high agreement with that belief already, presenting new information? And then lastly, which is more subjective, how do we assess the feasibility of changing a given belief within a campaign? And that comes into play with the creative concept component of a phase of developing a campaign. Considering Hornick and Wolf's approach, it's important to take into account the theoretical foundation that we use often. There are many others, but one that is often referred to, and that's the theory of planned behavior, which the behavioral and social scientists in the room, I'm sure you are familiar with. And with the theory of planned behavior, what we know is that, as I mentioned before, intention predicts behavior. And in turn, intention is shaped by that attitude towards the behavior, your subjective norm, as well as your perceived behavioral control. And all of those three factors are underlined or underpinned by beliefs. So what are your beliefs towards that behavior, your beliefs towards that norm, as well as your beliefs towards that perception or perceived control? So if I had a bright, shiny arrow with a bunch of light, it all points back to beliefs. So let's focus our efforts on changing beliefs, and in turn, we can, through a process, change behaviors. The application of that approach comes from Emily Brennan and colleagues at the University of Pennsylvania, or when she was at the University of Pennsylvania, where they took the Hornick and Wolf approach, and they did an analysis using cross-sectional data, conducted a study looking at clusters of beliefs tied to behavioral intention, and identifying which of those beliefs, one, had room to change and favorable room to change being associated with behavioral intention, as well as take into account what can FDA message on within their regulatory authority. So with those data, the FDA developed their initial campaign, The Real Cost, on targeting these specific beliefs. If I smoke, I will be controlled by smoking. I will not be independent. I will lose my teeth, have skin problems, and I will inhale chemicals. And I'll share later on how these beliefs and the foundation of these beliefs tied into the evaluation of the effectiveness of the campaign. Next, moving into concept development. So concept development is where all the magic happens, in my opinion. Concept development is where you take the learnings and the insights from the message development approach, and where the creative team comes in and really works their magic. Concept development includes primary data collection, largely qualitative in nature. You can introduce quantitative components to understand, is your messaging approach effective? It can be potentially effective. And is your execution of the messaging approach within certain creative element going to be effective and resonate with your target audience? This image that I came across really, for me, encapsulates the creative approach. So are there any Kanye West fans in the room? Or maybe people who don't want to admit that they're Kanye West fans in the room? The Kanye West, in terms of pop culture, you either love him or you hate him. I think there's universal agreement that he's really good at what he does. And with a creative director, I have a lot of creative director friends, so I hope I'm not offending them, but they have big personalities, maybe not as big as Kanye West, but they have big personalities as well. And they are geniuses. They do a lot of dynamic work, and there's an art that to their approach and to their field, where they can take a belief and insight of a belief, if I smoke, I will get wrinkles, and bring that to life and bring that to life in a really dynamic, engaging way using all of the prior research or additional research that we discussed in the message development phase of understanding who your target audience is and what motivates them and what their key attributes and social norms are, as well as their tobacco perceptions. Contextualizing that a little bit, some of the approaches that are taken and considerations that are made and that we've seen in the field with introducing a creative concept it can go a number of different ways, and I'll share some examples. So first we have humor versus fear appeal. And what we see both from practice as well as in the literature is that there are mixed results for which approach that you take when it comes to humor versus fear within the context of tobacco messaging. Traditionally, fear is deemed as most effective, and you see fear as being the primary method in comparison to humor that's taken both domestically as well as internationally in the development of an execution, I should say, of public health messaging or public education messaging, where humor is an approach that is used as well. However, in terms of behavior change, there are questions on whether it is actually effective as a standalone approach, not as a mixed approach, to impacting behavior change. The argument or I would say the claim that's made is that humor is a way to bring people in and engage people, and fear is the way that you actually change their behaviors. Another consideration when developing concepts and taking an approach is looking at gain frame versus loss frame. On the left, you have an example from FDA's recently launched Every Try Counts campaign, which takes a positive approach to encouraging cessation and highlights the benefits that one can obtain from sustaining or quitting, I should just say, cigarettes. On the opposite end, you have classic Terry, which most people are aware of from the TIPS campaign, where there's a focus on what you lose from tobacco use. Again, similar to humor versus fear appeal, loss frame tends to be more focused on fear, emotions such as sadness, empathy, and therefore tends to be more effective traditionally than a gain frame approach. But going back to what I shared before at the beginning, that we are at a time where we're trying to move the hardest to reach, hardest to move population. So we're taking different and innovative approaches to the messaging of tobacco public education campaigns. Another consideration in terms of contrast, personal testimonials versus other concept types. Personal testimonials through the literature and other sources are a proven strategy for effective public education messaging that leads to behavior change. We see messaging through personal testimonials, both domestically, again, and abroad. And we've also taken other approaches to developing concepts, looking at a peer approach and communicating the benefit of a peer approach to communicating the impact of modeling. So moving on to ad testing. Ad testing is, for me, one of the most, I should say the most, it's hard for me to pick, exciting components of doing the formative work. It's the last phase of the process before you launch and you go into market. And ad testing is sometimes referred to as concept testing, rough cut testing, and it's where you quantitatively assess the potential impact of the campaign through perceived effectiveness, which I'll discuss in a bit, as well as look at levels of comprehension, confusion and potential changes in beliefs of your campaign. And you essentially test what's called a rough cut ad. So I'm testing through my target and targeting my, using my target audience, what impact I may potentially have on them and any potential unintended consequences. So I mentioned perceived ad effectiveness. There are a number of components to ad testing as shared, but perceived ad effectiveness for me is the most compelling. This is a scale that was developed by Kevin Davis and colleagues for testing of tobacco ads and the potential for them to lead to behavior change. So this scale is made up of 6 items. This ad is worth remembering, grab my attention, is powerful, informative, meaningful, and convincing. And what is done during the copy testing or the ad testing phase is looking at this scale to see on a range, using a Likert scale from 1 to 5, from strongly disagree to strongly agree, where are ads falling above the midpoint of 3 to deem as being potentially effective? This is a validated scale, and on the right side of the slide, you see some examples from published information on the scores, what's called the PE scores, on the measures for that measure for FDA's The Real Cost campaign. And what you see is that to date, FDA has been successful in pre-testing of having their campaigns be above that midpoint of 3 and be essentially have the potential high level of impact for change once launched in the market. What's really interesting to me about perceived ad effectiveness are a number of things, and a number of things that are being explored right now. Are there other measures for measuring perceived effectiveness, and how do we verify or rate ads that are above the midpoint of 3 and potentially gauge what's the difference between a 3.3 and a 4.8 or 4.1 and a 3.6, for instance. And there's a lot of work being done right now by Seth Noor at the University of North Carolina and others to explore the variations between perceived ad effectiveness and other ways to measure perceived effectiveness. This is a table from recent research published by Kevin Davis, as I mentioned before, Jennifer Duke, and others, looking at the TIPS campaign and perceived effectiveness by race and ethnicity. So one assumption is that when you're developing a public education campaign, we want, when we think about our target and we think about the demographics of our target, we want to make sure we have people that look and represent that target. And often we think about race and ethnicity as one of them. What we found, what they found, and what I've seen in my experiences is that race and ethnicity is secondary to other factors of developing a campaign and developing messages, where race and ethnicity aren't the primary driver for predicting PE or having consumers or participants rate ad as being highly effective. What really resonates with them are some of those elements that we discussed in the message concept phase when it comes to tone, impact, framing, etc. Kevin Davis and Jennifer Duke and others also found that recently through the literature that there's a high correlation, and for the first time from a generalizable perspective, between PE and associated quit attempts for the TIPS campaign. Really interesting data. So implementation, I'll go through implementation really quickly because it's not my area of expertise. I'm sort of the bread between the sandwich with the formative research and the evaluation. This approach is really, my colleagues in the implementation and creative phase can speak more to that. But when it comes to implementation and how do we make sure our messages are reaching the right people, there is sort of what I call a media trifecta, or what we call in the field a media trifecta: paid media, owned media, and earned media. I think the cat is out of the bag right now with Facebook and everything that's going on. There's nothing that's organic anymore, and it's been like that for a long time. So when it comes to, from a practical level, implementation of a campaign, a lot of it is paid, and paid targeting of messaging to make sure you have exposure for the right people. Lastly, there's the evaluation phase. And sort of big reveal, does evaluation work? And there's a number of ways to do evaluation. And so the answer is, the cat is out of the bag, not a surprise for you all. Yes, of course, it does work. And evidence of that, pulling some screen grabs domestically and pulling from research from Australia, and there are many other examples, we see that public education campaigns have significantly impacted the rates of tobacco use when it comes to adults and youth in large ways and significant ways, and it's had a significant public health impact. How has that been measured? That's been measured through a number of different ways, from cross-sectional data, longitudinal data, as well as other methods, where using this logic model, this is the foundation of how you evaluate a campaign, as well as what you use to develop it and what you aspire for. So you want to make sure you have a high level of ad awareness. You want to change target attitudes, beliefs, as well as then in turn move on to influencing intentions and behaviors. Focusing on beliefs is where we started as a focus back during the message development phase, is measuring the impact of targeted beliefs. Going back to the Hornick and Wolf approach and the information that I shared from Emily Brennan and others during the formative research process, using FDA's The Real Cost campaign and how they messaged on certain beliefs and how they measure the effectiveness. This table is from a publication that was released last year, which shows these two tables, how beliefs were measured and the campaign had an impact. So I'll focus on the table for now on the left side of the screen, which shows 8 specific beliefs that the campaign targeted. 2 of them, if I smoke, I will get wrinkles, and 2 of them, if I smoke, I will get skin problems, as examples. So what was looked at following with the evaluation study following a cohort of youth was, at baseline, what were the levels of agreement with this belief? And at second follow-up, approximately a year later, a little bit more, where was there change? And you see in the last column, there was significant change in that belief. And going a little bit further, conducting 3 regression analysis, you see there's a correlation between what's described as TRP, target rating points, a measurement for ad exposure, a correlation between increased target rating points cumulatively for a campaign and agreement and increased odds of believing if I smoke I will get wrinkles, as well as looking at specific target rating points for that specific ad, as well as self-reported measures of exposure. And then below, you see on the right side of the slide a correlation between increased target rating points as well as agreement with various beliefs targeted by the campaign, where increased TRPs led to increased belief and relative change in the beliefs of those target messages and those target beliefs. So lastly, wrapping it up with future considerations. So went through from a very high level components from beginning to end of developing, implementing, and evaluating a public education campaign. And I'll close with some of the considerations that I'm grappling with and that my colleagues are grappling with. So how do we continue to implement effective communication campaigns in this changing and cluttered media landscape? How do we keep up with emerging technologies and increasingly crowded media environment? And there are practical ways to go about answering this question, as well as scientific ways to going about answering this question. Improve formative research strategies. So what innovative methods can we use to improve the efficiency as well as the accuracy of message testing? I'm really excited about some new innovative approaches to testing of messaging and formative research. One specifically is using fMRI data to assess the potential impact of messaging, which, just a note, Emily Falk at the University of Memphis that's a plug for my alma mater, at the University of Pennsylvania, is really looking into this area and is doing really innovative work in that in that topic. New and emerging tobacco products, how do we message about products with lower perceived risk of harm? Thinking about the emergence of e-cigarettes and other tobacco products, and also considering upcoming regulatory actions by FDA where there are specifically reduced levels of nicotine, and how that's going to play into risk perceptions when it comes to the use of cigarette and combustible products. And lastly, looking at sustained tobacco disparities. So despite the progress that we've made on a national level broadly, as well as within the context of public education campaigns, there still are significant health disparities, specifically when it comes to the Midwest and the southern states in terms of tobacco use. So there's still a lot of work to be done. I know the Truth Initiative, as well as others, are focused on that topic and focus on making an impact there. And what can public education campaigns do, and how can we use what we've learned to date with public education campaigns to really have an impact in reducing tobacco disparities that still exist both domestically and abroad. And then lastly, if you have any questions, obviously feel free to reach out to me, but also wanted to give a highlight to health communications best practices that were just released last week by the CDC, which provides a lot of content as well as context to the development and best practices for the development and evaluation of effective public education campaigns. So with that, thank you for your time, and welcome any questions you have. Sure, definitely.
Great, thank you. It was really interesting. Could you say a little bit more about your piloting? So is that done just in like a focus groups or set of groups, or is it at like a county level? I mean, when you're actually just trying out things, how do you actually do that?
Two ways. So to answer your question, and the question was, when we're piloting, how is that done? Is that done on a county level, or is it done through research? And I would say both. It depends on the campaign. Piloting, it depends on how many resources you have to do, I would say, rigorous testing prior. So if the approach is based on best practices, proven methods, and we have a high level of confidence in who we're trying to reach and what's going to motivate and move them, as well as have the resources to do large scale, say, ad testing, as well as message development, then I think there may be a high level of confidence in rolling out a message or a campaign without doing any real world piloting. However, and I know FDA has publicly shared this for some of their campaigns, where there are new methods that are taken, and there are questions both when it comes to both process and outcome, and evaluating the ability to not just successfully launch a campaign, but also have an impact, where they've taken an approach to piloting some of their work in a smaller location. So the answer to your question is both, and it depends on the situation.
Tesfa, it's really interesting. I'm wondering to what extent or in what ways these kinds of campaigns exist within the landscape of pro-tobacco marketing. So I know there's no explicit counter-marketing that you discussed in this talk, but are current ad campaigns considered at all when developing prevention or cessation messaging?
Yeah, that's a great question. So the question was, to what extent are these type of campaigns considered when it comes to pro-tobacco marketing, and are they taken into account during the development of anti-tobacco messaging? And so the answer is yes, in twofold. So pro-tobacco marketing, I would say in terms of dollars and resources, we try to compete, but as you all know, it's really difficult to compete. But at the same time, there's still significant work and impact that we can have. And pro marketing is considered during the full development phase, but especially when it comes to the messaging and strategy development. So taking into consideration what are youth exposed to when it comes to pro tobacco marketing, and what has that exposure done when it comes to their perceptions of risk and their perceptions in terms of social norms. So that's taken into account from that perspective. And then also I think about, and then touch on it with this discussion, but tobacco, anti-tobacco marketing that's done in a retail environment. So there's a lot of work on the state, local, federal level, and important work on anti-tobacco messaging in a retail environment. And there, obviously, there's a direct correlation with taking into account the pro-tobacco marketing that consumers are exposed to when they go into a retail environment.
Hello. So I have two questions.
Sure.
The first one, and you might have said this, but with the ad testing, what population are you using to test that ad? Is it your target audience or the general population?
Yeah. So the question is, when we're doing ad testing, who do we use? Is the general population or the target audience? And the answer is the target audience. So the target audience with ad testing, going back to Nikki and Travis, we want to make sure that these ads are effective and will not have an unintended consequence when it comes to Nikki and Travis or your specific target audience. So the target audience are the participants that are involved in ad testing.
Okay. Sure. And then I was just kind of thinking about this process in other type of countries. Mm-hmm. So would you, like Thailand, would you go through this initial type of process in Thailand, or I mean really anywhere, or would you, is one medium more effective than another, especially in maybe more rural parts of the country, mm-hmm. where maybe they don't have as much access to televisions, mm-hmm. or smartphones, or what's the approach for that? Because I think in America, our rate of tobacco consumption is definitely decreased, but it's still pretty prevalent in other areas mm-hmm. of the world.
Definitely. So the question is, how do we apply, or would we apply the same approach in an international setting where there are different levels of access, different media, access to media, and access to resources more broadly? And the answer to your question is, it depends. Right, and so I think it depends on what country we are talking about, or what the tobacco use rates are, what the norms are, what the media environment is. And what I would say to answer your question more specifically is that I think from this model and best practices that we know from implementing this model, that there are things that we can take that can be applied universally. However, it makes sense to not come in with that model and think that it's just going to work in Thailand, as you mentioned, or another country, because there are different determinants when it comes to tobacco use, as well as you mentioned, different media environments. So we've seen through international work that public education campaigns have been effective at a different scale. You don't need millions of dollars to, it helps, but you don't need millions of dollars to have an effective public education campaigns. And also the value of, if you have limited resources, having a limited amount of sort of paid media coupled with a specific approach or initiative that encourages interpersonal communication and that having an influence there. So those are some thoughts to respond to your question.
I think we're going to have to end it there, but thanks for giving such a great overview of the approach that you've taken and found effective. And I think, so anyway, thank you for sharing all of your expertise with us today. It's been really enlightening, and I appreciate you coming and sharing that with us.
Sure.
Thank
Thank
you.
you.